So today we're going to talk about the red stuff. We're going to start talking about muscle. So first we're going to do a physiology class a little bit, and then we're going to start going through the trunk muscles, the axial skeletal muscles. Some of my favorite stuff. When we look at muscle tissue, what does the function of the tissue? We always have to ask, what's the function of something? The function is basically what it does. It shortens. That's not really that good. It shortens in length, so it comes together. It's attached to two ends of one bone here and one bone here, and when it shortens, it moves the bone. Or two bones, one bone closer to the other bone. So that's movement. When it shortens and it moves bones around, we move around. You go walk that way. That's really cool. Could you imagine it'd be a tree? I mean, that'd be horrible. No muscle. The other thing we can do when we contract is we can stand up. We can have posture. With no muscle thing, we're all hanging on the bones. If the muscles are contracting, then we can actually stand up. And then we're teenagers, we still don't really care. We just walk around like that and monkey out. And then we get old and never look like that if we keep doing that. So posture is actually really, really important. So muscle does that. Also, muscle supports soft tissue. Like behind this gut wall, there's a whole gut. That's protection. Otherwise, it would all spill out all the time. That's pretty cool. It regulates movement in and out of the body. Yeah, you eat and you poop. And you pee. That's movement. The muscle is around, like the round muscle around a mouse. That's an orbicularis. You have these round sphincter muscles. We can also call them that. They help with the in and out of the body. Also, movement through the gut tube, for example, is because of muscle. So there's muscle inside the tubes. Also the blood tubes. There's also the arteries and the veins, not so much, but a little bit. But the arteries, there's muscle too. Then we also generate heat with muscle. That's very important. So if we're too cold, we can shiver, and we're going to have heat coming, or we don't freeze. That helps. Of course, when it's really hot outside also already, and you have to then you run around, and then that heat's not really that happy. Then we're going to sweat to cool off. Because then we carry the heat from the inside of the body to the outside of the body when we cool off, when we sweat. Good. Muscle tissue has a few characteristics. When we talk about things, we talk about what's the characteristics. One of the things is it's excitable. That means I can poke it and it's going to do something. I can irritate it and stimulate it and something's going to happen. So that's an excitation. They also call that it's irritable. Irritation. That doesn't mean it's going to scream at you because it's irritable, but it means it reacts. It's a reactive tissue. And responsiveness is another term that we use. So it can receive and respond to a stimulus, and that's usually a nerve impulse. Well, that is a nerve impulse. Muscle contracts, we talked about it, shortens. That's all it does, it shortens. It doesn't do anything else. Actively. I'm going to say actively. Because passively, once it shortens, it can elongate again. But it's a passive movement. It doesn't, once it shortens, it's not just stuck here. You can actually lengthen it again. So that's extensibility. Passively extend and stretch. And elasticity is an ability to recoil and go back to a resting length. So if it's pushed, stretched a little far out, then it bounces back. So that's a resting length. So it has a little springiness to it. This is the active piece here. This is really what we're going to talk about most when we talk about how it does it, is contractility. And that ability to shorten, first it's triggered by a nerve impulse. So the muscle has to be talked to. Well, the main one we study, which is this kind of muscle stuff. The heart muscle we're going to study when we do the heart. We'll talk briefly about it. And the gut muscles, we don't really study them that much, a little bit. But that contractility in all the muscle types is caused by two protein threads, or two types of protein threads, inside the muscles gliding past one another. So if you have a length of a muscle, and this is a little piece of a length of a muscle, this is actually the cell membrane of the muscle right here. And these threads, or these little lines, those are proteins, and they glide past one another, and that makes the muscle short. That's it. Not quite, but almost. Oh, terminology, always important too. If you see the word myo or mesio, you know it's muscle. If you see the term sarco, you also know it's muscle. It means flesh. But most of us, flesh stuff is muscle. And lately fat, but not in the old days. So you want to know these prefixes to recognize when you read stuff that, oh, that must be muscle. So we have three types of muscle. We have skeletal muscle, that's the main one we're going to talk about. That's the one that creates movement and posture. That muscle is under conscious control. So I can think about moving that muscle. Oh yeah, look at that. It moves. That's cool. So I can think about it, it moves. They call that voluntary. My will is involved in it, or conscious. When I look at the slide, it's long cylindrical cells. So they're just long bands like threads. For us, it looks like threads. A cell will look like a thread in our eyes. And it is multinucleated, meaning it has more than one nucleus. So you have a muscle from here to here, longest muscle in the body, sartorius. One fiber goes from here to here. That's one muscle fiber. That's one muscle cell. And this cell is tiny. You can't see a cell, it's that tiny. That's like 6 micron and stuff, or 4 to 5 for a red blood cell. That's tiny. But it goes the whole length. And so when that muscle is so skinny, when that muscle is made, it is not one muscle, it's multiple muscles laid one after the other, and they fuse together as we grow. The nuclei don't go away, so they have more than one nucleus in that one cell that is fused. That make sense? Because it's too hard to make one long muscle like that. You have to sort of piece it together and then fuse it. When you look in a microscope, you see these lines this way, and you see these lines this way. That's called a striated look. It's very, very well organized. And what that is, that striated look, is an internal protein thread arrangement. So we'll go deep and look at that in a little bit. That's the skeletal muscle. The cardiac muscle is the heart muscle. If that looks really organized up here, right here, that looks a little less organized. But you still have these little striations if you look close. You still have these lines here a little bit, but they're smaller. They're branched. They have one nucleus. You don't think about contract. Thank God you don't have to think about contracting that one. It just does it. Boom, 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 boom. One feature that's very interesting, and there's one like right here, apparently, are the intercalated discs. And we talked briefly about these junctions between the epithelial cells, if you go back to that slide, and intercalated discs are in there. The intercalated discs are the gap junctions and desmosomes. Remember, gap junctions are sort of channels from cell to cell, and desmosomes are really anchoring strands that hold the cell strong together. And so a heart muscle, you have multiple muscles. Here's a muscle, then here's a muscle. You want them to be strong, held together to one another, and be able to have nerve impulses go straight through it, because that way we can have a whole heart contract as one unit, when all the muscle orchestrated contract as one. And it's possible because of the gap junctions. And the desmosomes make the different cells don't pull each other apart. They hold them really strong together. So that's cardiac muscle. Smooth muscle is the last type. And we don't really talk too much about that. It's involuntary. It looks more like spindles. It's like a little bit more like that looking, not like cylindrical. has one nucleus. They're very small. It's unconscious, not monetary control. You can hear it when your stomach talks to you, then you hear it, but when it moves. But you don't think about moving it. Otherwise, that's an easy way to get out of date, huh? Then you could just do that. It's non-striated. It doesn't have to be held together. It's much more loosely arranged. But it's interesting because like this is where you have peristalsis, like the stomach churning stuff. That's this kind of muscle type. And it can do that for a long time. So it can hold sustained contractions, this muscle type. The other muscle type has to relax. Like the heart muscle does this. And then relaxes. So half the time the heart muscle doesn't contract. That's a resting phase. That's why we have to look at cardiology that way too. Like your resting phase, your active phase. If their active phase is longer, then we got to do something about it because the heart muscle works harder. And you know, it's a muscle that has to work a whole life long. Okay, so those are the three types. Now we pretty much go to skeletal muscle from here on. So we're going to talk about how that thing works. How does that thing work? My dad just took off from the airplane a little bit. No, not yet, but he will. And he's like, what are you doing tonight? I'm like, here, let me give you the spiel. So this is a slide, a microscopic slide of this. This here is a cell. Is this a cell? Yeah. Inside this, so this is the cell here too. This is the model for the cell. This is the cell membrane. In a muscle, that cell membrane is called a sarcolemma. Sarco means muscle. Good. I know. A nerve comes on, this is actually a nerve here. A nerve comes onto the muscle and attaches to the sarcolemma. There's a little gap in there, but it is able then to stimulate that sarcolemma, that cell membrane. That cell membrane penetrates deep into all the little subunits within this muscle. See all these round things? Hi, how are you?
Good, carry on, sorry.
These are little subunits of this big muscle. They actually have a name, and the name for those is myofibril. And muscle fiber, we can also, muscle fiber, and myofiber is the whole muscle, and myofibril is almost like a smaller little muscle inside of it. A little muscle. So that's one of these things, a myofibril. And so that sarcolemma penetrates all the way through around this blue thing. Here's yellow. I know, here's blue, here's yellow. But it goes all the way through around every myofibril. And so this way, when the nerve says, hey, we got to contract this muscle, the nerve impulse goes to the whole muscle. And then what does that nerve impulse really do? That nerve impulse does one thing. It stimulates this blue baggy thing here. Here it's the other color, it's pale. But inside this baggie, we have calcium ions. And we call that baggy thing the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Where is it? The name here. Sarcoplasmic reticulum. So the sarcolemma is the cell membrane that penetrates deep around every myofibril. And then the sarcoplasmic reticulum is like the endoplasmic reticulum in the regular cell. It's just very specific as an organelle, and all it has in here is calcium. And so the nerve impulse then stimulates that back to release the calcium to the inside of the myofibril. And once that happens, let's look at the inside of the myofibril. On the inside of the myofibril, we have protein threads. These protein threads come in. And you see, here's a myofibril. You see these little lines here? That's one type of protein thread. That's actually this one right here. This C line here is actually a disc that goes around the whole myofibril and anchors these thin filaments, these protein threads, onto it. So they call them thin filaments because the other type looks like that and it has a little head on top. See the head? And that head it looks kind of, it's like multiples of them, and then the heads are sticking out, so it kind of looks funny. But if you take one out, it looks like that. And those are actually right here, from the center towards that Z line. So they overlap the other ones a little bit. So, yeah, you haven't separated here, but these overlap a little bit. And where they overlap, you can have this situation right here. So that's the one with that head, and the other one is just that little filament, that thin filament. The thin filament is called actin, and this is called myosin, but we're going to get there in a minute again. I want to first get the concept of it. Because so now the calcium gets released into the inside of these myofibrils, surrounding all these little filaments, these little thin and thick, these protein threads. And what it does, it lets a strand that covers sort of a magnet type, they call it an active site, that's like a magnet on this, that then the head can attach to it. The calcium removes that thread and opens the active site, and that means it's like a magnet that is on this actin, and the myosin head can attach onto it. That's all the calcium does. And at that point, when that happens, this head moves. It moves, one stroke. And when it does that, the inside thread pull the outside thinner thread a little bit closer to one another. And that's a muscle contraction right there. I know, complicated. Let's put some words to it. So we already talked about sarcolemma is the cell membrane that goes into these myofibrils, deep inside of them. Don't worry about this L and T and L system. They just have these names also. The sarcolemma that goes deep into the inside, they call that the T tubules, and then the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is the blue back, they call that the L system, wherever that is. But what we need to know is that the sarcoplasmic reticulum goes into the myofibril and activates the sarcolemma, goes inside to the myofibril, it activates the sarcoplasmic reticulum that releases the calcium to the inside of the myofibril. And when that's the case, then we're going to have the active site on the thin filament, which is called the actin. There's two names. We always have these names, right? Have you noticed that in anatomy? There's all these damn names. I don't really test too heavy on this. So it's really mostly understanding for you guys, okay? But the myosin head attaches then to that active site that's freed up because the calcium is in there, and at that point, ATP, you remember ATP? That's the energy, right? ATP makes sure that the contraction happens because it helps the head, it helps move the head back and forth. So what it actually does, the ATP, when it attaches to the myosin, the head stands up, and then when the active side is free and the head can attach to it, the head bends downward. It's like a spring that you let go, and at that point the ADP releases and a new ATP comes back on it and does that cocking of the head again, catches the spring again, so then it can be let go. So it's really funky, but not that complicated. It's just physiology, so it takes a few times to visualize it. So when somebody dies, the integrity of here is not taken care of anymore. And the calcium all goes into the muscle tissue. And then the person gets really stiff and the muscles don't move. And that's called rigor mortis. Have you ever heard of that? Right? Rigor mortis. So that's what happens when the calcium is released. All these are attached, but there's no ATP ready to move the things around. That's what rigor mortis is. Any questions with that? Or is you starting to get a little bit? Make some sense? No? Okay, let's do it again. Let me just read it, make sure. Myofibril are a shortening contractile organelles in the muscle. So these are these things, we talked about them. Multiple. They are composed of thick They are the myofilaments, and thin, they're the actin myofilaments. These little strands inside. A sarcomere is another term, but you don't need to study it for this class. But that's a unit that we can understand how this muscle contraction works. We often take a piece of the body that explains of how the whole structure works and study that one thing. And that's the thing for the muscle. Because otherwise I have to take this whole muscle out and study the whole thing. It's too overwhelming because it just repeats itself. And so that's a sarcomere. Actin are anchored and held in place at the end of the sarcomeres by a Z disc. They protrude from both ends towards the center of the sarcomere. What that means is, this is the Z disc. There is this like sort of a disc. You can't really see it's a disc. But it holds all these actins together, and then they go from both sides towards the center. Myosin filaments are in the center of the sarcomere, reaching towards the Z disc, overlapping with the actin filaments. And so that's these right here. They're in the inside, they're overlapping. Where they overlap, they can attach to one another. Myosin filaments have a head and a tail. We talked about the head. The head is going to attach to the actin filament. When the muscle shortens, actin and myosin slide past one another, shortening the sarcomere while preserving the length of the actin and myosin. Yeah, it's like the ropes that just go past one another, tug of war. During a contraction, tension-activated myosin heads bond to actin filaments and pull them towards the middle of the sarcomere with a swinging or rowing motion. Now that's complicated. What that means is this motion. Up and down, forward and backwards. Myosin heads then release from actin and get activated again with the ATP. So that's this cycle. And if you actually, this is called the sliding filament theory, which now you know how it works. That's the main theory that explains muscle contraction. So I didn't name it. But what this down here means is again what we said, when the head, the ATP binds to the head. That makes the head go upward and it stands up. And then it's, the energy is lost. So we have an ADP and a phosphate. And at that point, it can attach to the myosin head, to the actin, and it can do its work passively and bend down as letting go of the spring. The ADP detaches, a new ATP comes in, and we do the same thing again. That's that theory, that circle. And here's just some nice slide that talks about what the calcium does. The calcium, this is a thread here on top of the thin filament, so it's even a smaller thread on top of the small thread. And then it's got some other goofy thing here, 3 balls. Look at these things, they're like these structures. And that's where the calcium attaches. This changes shape and it moves that smaller thing away, and the active side is freed up, but the myosin can attach to it. If you didn't get that, that's fine. Just the detail, what does the calcium do? You go back later. But I want you to get this piece as a thinking part. Because it's going to come back in bio 2 if you take bio 2 or 28, and it's just going to be way fast. And so I want to make sure we have that a little bit down. So this is why I also put this slide into the booklet, because this shows us the whole thing one more time, in one thing, on one picture. So the first thing that happens is the nerve, that's a nerve, it talks to the sarcolemma, which then sends a nerve impulse down into the myofibril, talking to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which releases the calcium into the myofibril. The calcium then goes and makes sure the active sites on the actin is free by moving the strand. At that point, the myosin head can attach to the actin active site and do its magic by working pulling the actin closer to itself and having that head motion going on. When the muscle contraction finishes, the calcium will go back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The active side on the actin is no longer free, and we cannot have those two connect to one another. The muscle is relaxed. Got it? Good. No? Well, I guess we probably should do it again next time. Always repeat a few times. Then, after that, we have to basically talk about the nerve talking to the muscle. Skeletal muscles are stimulated by nerve impulses. The end of a nerve connecting to a muscle is called a motor end plate. Motor end plate. Motor nerves are the ones that go from the brain to the muscles and talk to the muscle. The neuromuscular junction, which is an area where the nerve and the muscles connect. So that's just another term that we look at. That is an easy understandable term. Neuromuscular junction. That's where the nerve and the muscle connect. So that's with anatomy. We gotta slow it down, and then we understand the language. It's actually fun when you do that with your own language. I just had another word in Swiss German. I was with my dad talking, and he's like, "Oh, I'm feeling so a little loopy in the head after skiing." And he's used the word "Durabirot," and it's like that means you run through a red light. I was like, really? But I was just turned for 48 years. I never knew what it meant until I started slowing everything down and go like, what does that mean? Since now I don't think in Swiss anymore, it's just all English or something like that. But yeah, the same is with anatomy. You want to be slow with reading it. So the nerve goes to the muscle. And what's interesting here is one nerve can stimulate a varied amount of muscle cells. When I want to do something, when the brain talks to the muscles, it can stimulate one nerve that talks to the muscle. It can stimulate 10 nerves that talk to the muscle. One nerve can innervate one muscle cell or more than one muscle cell. Varied amounts. But I can only stimulate one nerve at a time. Now, I cannot just stimulate one nerve at a time, but I cannot stimulate a half a nerve. I have to stimulate one nerve. And so what that means is when I have a motor unit, which is that muscle and the nerve connected to it, that goes to one nerve that goes to multiple muscle cells, like many muscle cells, then that nerve stimulates all those muscle cells contract at once. If many muscle cells are innervated, we're going to have a muscle that has very crude motor function. It's a very strong muscle. So this muscle here has one nerve, has a lot of muscle fibers that it goes to. When I kick this, it's strong. Well, it was strong, but it should be strong. When I have a finger or a facial muscle that is very fine motor skill, that needs to be very minutely moved and not too much strength all at once, then I have like a nerve go to only a few of these muscle fibers. A motor unit consisting of a few fibers will create a weak contraction with great fine motor control. A nerve innervating many cells creates a crude but a strong contraction. The more motor units recruited, so we can recruit multiple motor units, so we can vary the contraction. The more motor units contracted, the stronger contraction. But we get fatigue potentially. So if I fire all the motor units in a quad, I'm going to get fatigue. If I run, I have to vary which motor unit is stimulated, and some muscle fibers are relaxing, so they have to rest for a second. Yes?
So, innervate, is that another way of saying like muscle fit?
Oh yes, innervation means the nerve goes to the muscle. So when we briefly mentioned that when we talked about the facial muscles. In the beginning we said a muscle has an origin where it attaches to a point, like a starting point, and then it has an insertion, which is the end of the bone it goes into that then moves. And that's what the movement is the action of a muscle. And which nerve goes to the muscle, that's known as the innervation. We don't study innervations here. But in a higher class, you're going to potentially have to say, oh, the biceps is innervated by this and this muscle, musculocutaneous muscle, and so forth. But we don't have to do that. When I look at muscle metabolism, we need a lot of ATP in muscle. It's a big deal. We make ATP in the mitochondria. Muscle needs large amounts of energy. It has many, many mitochondria. The easiest fuel that we have to make ATP is glucose, that's sugar. And so muscle can store some sugar as glycogen. Remember glycogen? It's the sugar storage molecule. We have a lot in the liver that it chops it off, puts it in the sugar, so when our blood sugar goes down, it's we have reserves to bring it back up a little bit. We're not going to just collapse. Then oxygen helps make ATP, a lot of ATP. We talked briefly about that. In the mitochondria, we make a lot of ATP, but in the mitochondria, we need oxygen. We can make ATP from glucose outside of the mitochondria, but it's very little ATP that we get. So that's the problem in muscle, is when we have not sufficient oxygen, then we have to make ATP, not in the mitochondria, but outside of the mitochondria. So we're very inefficient at that point. This causes the buildup then of another byproduct. It's called lactate. And that then has to be converted back to glucose in the liver. And lactate tires muscles easily. And so that's when we run around really, really fast anaerobically, because the muscles, a lot of muscles that are really fast twitch muscles that run as fast, they don't have as many mitochondria, because when the muscle squeezes, the blood's all squeezed out of everything. And so we have to then, in those muscles, particularly put creatine phosphate in, and that's used as a rapid way of making ATP from ADP. So let's look at them over here, when we have these little picture. This here is when we get glucose into the system, but we do not have it. Yes, sir.
Going back to muscle metabolism.
Yes.
Is that why we get sore? Is that why?
Yeah. Well, soreness is also when we tear the muscles a little bit, when we start working out. That also creates soreness. And that's, then the muscle reacts in making more muscle, making bigger muscle, stronger muscle. So this here is that normal. We get the glucose, we eat the glucose, it goes into the bloodstream, we go into the cell, it breaks down the glucose, and when it breaks down the glucose, it makes 2 ATP. We do not need oxygen. No oxygen needed. Look, see here? No oxygen needed. We can do that. Energy source, glucose, no oxygen needed. Duration of energy provision, look, about 30 to 60 seconds of energy, and then we're done with that one. Then we're exhausted. So that's your sprint. Then postural muscles in particular use the glucose as the further step. It goes into the mitochondria. This is a mitochondria right here. And look at that, it makes 36 ATP out of that same glucose, because we have oxygen ready and present. That's why we can do that. That's great. Hours of energy. And then we have the creatine phosphate way of doing it. And that's a simple step where we have the creatine phosphate. So the P is the phosphate. We want to take that P and put it onto the ADP and make an ATP. You remember ADP is 2-phosphate, ATP is 3-phosphate. So we use the ATP to run the muscle cycle, that's sliding filament theory, and we take the creatine phosphate to put a P back onto it right away. And then we have about 15 seconds of energy from that. So it's also not much, but it's also very fast available energy for that perspective. Okay, so that's the energy stuff that I wanted to talk about. And here's a little bit of fast twitch and the slow twitch fiber. Those are, depending on what the muscle needs to do, like a postural muscle needs to contract a long time so I can stand upright. That's a different type of muscle than my quad that needs to run. Well, the quad's a little mixed. A lot of muscles are mixed. So when we discuss that, the twitch in a slow or fast twitch in the muscle, the twitch is the length of one contraction. So some muscle cells are slower to contract, not as forceful, but can hold a contraction much longer. They rely on oxygen more. Postural muscles, oxygen. And they harbor a large amount of myoglobin. What's myoglobin? Oh, myoglobin is like hemoglobin. You know what hemoglobin does? Carries oxygen. Hemoglobin is inside of the red blood cells, and it carries oxygen through the body. So when you go, the blood goes by the lungs, it picks up an oxygen. The oxygen goes into the hemoglobin, is held by the hemoglobin like a magnet. When then the blood travels through the tissues in the body, and where we have some need for oxygen, it sucks it into the tissue. And the tissue can use it and go to the mitochondria and make ATP. That's perfect. The muscle needs so much oxygen, it's got this thing that's like a hemoglobin, but it's a myoglobin. Myo means muscle. And it's like another magnet for oxygen, but it's a stronger magnet than the hemoglobin. So when the blood goes by the muscle, it just sucks it out and stores it in there. And so that's kind of cool. Store large amounts of oxygen. Myoglobin color muscles red. They are slow, aka then the muscles that use the oxygens and have a lot of the myoglobins in it are the postural muscles. So they're slow to contract, but they can hold the contraction for a long time. On the other hand, fast, forceful contractions, muscles are tire easily. They look more pale in comparison, are called fast or phasic muscles. And so from our purposes, the most important piece here is that we have different types of muscle. They all work the same. They just have a little different energy metabolism going on with it. When we contract the muscle, the muscle fiber shortens in length. So we can lift something up. However, we can also just hold something. But it's still contracting. I'm not moving a muscle, but I'm holding something and it doesn't fall down. So there's two different types of contractions. One that moves the muscle, and one that doesn't move the muscle, it just holds it in a position. When the muscle just, where's the isometric one? No, never mind. When a muscle just holds a weight and doesn't shorten, it's known as an isometric contraction. Isometric contraction. I remember that ISO means same. Metric is a meter, that's a length measure. So the same length is an isometric contraction. An isotonic, iso means same, tonic refers to the tone of the muscle. How does the muscle feel? How forceful is it contracting? That's when the muscle moves. The changes, it moves. And we can even go further and have another description on it. When the muscle shortens in terms of its contraction, it's known as a concentric contraction. It shortens. When it lengthens, it's known as an eccentric contraction. So some people say, and I'm not a workout person really, so I don't really know all the details on that stuff, but the eccentric contractions build the muscle stronger, faster, to letting go. So when you see someone, you go, ugh, you go like, no, both are actually contractions. The letting go is a more important part than the contracting part. It's good to do, I like doing the weights slow, lower weights but slow, and not fast and heavy weights, because it's the same weight at the end. If you do it slow and fast, it's just you're much more safe if you don't go too fast and you don't use too much weight. There was this guy in Colorado that I was told in a workshop that we did, and he was Mr. Colorado, whatever, bodybuilder thing, and he was showing it off, and he was like 200 pounds, I don't know how much, also the bone breaks. Too much force. Like, no, we don't need to do that. Muscle attachments, we talked about it before, but let's go through it again. We have most muscles attached, the skeletal muscles attached to the skeleton. That's why they're called skeletal muscles. So we have an origin, and that's a starting place a bony attachment that remains stable or fixed during a contraction, so that doesn't move. So like here, the biceps, that's the shoulder area. And then we got an insertion, and that's the other part, and that's where the muscle attaches into a bone, and that bone is the one that moves. So here's the forearm, the radius on the bicep. It's the movable part. Muscles that work, well, if you look at the muscle, this is a good example. You've got a biceps here, and then you've got a triceps in the back, brachialis. And if the biceps contracts, the triceps has to relax. Otherwise, you're stuck. You can't move. So that's a neurological concept that we need to know. So the muscle that contracts is known as the agonist. Agonist. The muscle that does the opposite motion, like here, it's relaxing, that's known as the antagonist. Against. And means against. I'm against. Oh, you can't read that, huh? Hold on. Agonist equals mover, the one that moves. An antagonist, agonist, is the opposite motion. Has to relax. If the agonist contracts, the other one has to relax. And then we got a third one we want to talk about, and those are synergists, right here. Synergists. And these are helpers. Because a lot of motions in the body, like, you know, this is fine. But what about wobbling back and forth, having to adapt to different forces? I got multiple different muscles that help me with the balancing. So one is the one that does the main motion, the other ones help. The synergists are helpers, and then you got one or more that are against the opposite motion. I know so many terms. Holy moly. Again, if the terms are overwhelming, I know I have to do them. Try to get the concepts of this stuff. Don't focus on the terms. There's no test question that says this stuff on it. The test is about labeling. Okay? But I need us to know it because it's such cool stuff and I like to talk about it. Muscle come in different shapes. And what's most important here for me is, well, the muscle in the middle, this is a regular type of muscle looking thing. Here like this one is the sartorius. The muscle has a tendon that goes into a bone, and then it has the muscle itself, the belly of the muscle. And so we have some muscle that they're nicely parallel arranged. The parallel arranged muscle fibers are long and have not as much strength though, because the fiber goes a whole length of the muscle into the tendon. Then though we have an interesting arrangement of muscle. We have this thing called the pennate muscle. And penna means feather. So it's a feather muscle. So we have a tendon here, and then you got the muscle that goes in an angle into that tendon. It's like short little muscle fibers. So they're arranged, inserted at an angle are shorter, and then they can exert more force that way. So the pennate muscles are forceful muscles. So right here, you got pennate stuff. Lots of strength. Quads. Strongest muscles you have. Unipennate is the fiber inserted in a tendon from one side. Bipennate, that's this one. Bipennate is when the fibers come from both sides. That anchor into it. Tendons are bundles of collagen fibers with a great tensile strength that they transfer a force from a muscle to the bone. So tendons are muscle to bone. Ligaments are bone to bone connections. Ligaments are around joints. Tendons are the muscles. A flat tendon, just as a term, is called an aponeurosis. Just look up stuff. That way you have all this data at some point you might need in the one little thing, and you can all look it up. Terminology scared the crap out of me in anatomy, so I want to try to be as sensible about it as I can be. I thought I was going to fail my chiropractic school just because of that kind of stuff, but it didn't work out that way. Okay, then there's one more piece here, and then I'm done with this part, and I got to go through the muscles. Auxiliary structures. Ooh, that's a difficult word. The main function of those structures is to reduce friction in the muscles. So when you move a muscle, that's a lot of movement, a lot of friction, a lot of heat. Things that rub against each other create a lot of heat. And so we need to figure out how to reduce the friction so we have a minimal amount of heat gets created and inflammation that way. Muscle fascia is one that allows muscles to glide over each other. So fascia is, it's the white stuff. It's all the white stuff we can sort of call fascia, not the red stuff. Synovial tendon sheets, that's a cool thing. We have this thing, a synovial tendon sheet, or also synovial bursa, and those are little cushions. They're actually wrappings around the tendon, for example. Here you see right here, wraps around the tendon, the biceps tendon, and those are little wrapping things with fluid inside, and they help move the tendon in and out. And so it doesn't heat up, it doesn't rub, it's gliding more with them. And the bursa is similar, it's in between muscles, and it acts like a cushioning device or a rubbing, decrease the rubbing. You've got some right in here in your acromion. So it's less rubbing. So if you have a bursitis, have you heard of bursitis? No? Tendinitis? Bursitis? A tendinitis would be an inflammation of a tendon. If that hurts, it might be a tendinitis. A bursitis is when the bursa is inflamed and expands. That's a problem. Because if it's trying to reduce the friction, but it gets overstimulated, then it creates more friction, then that's definitely a problem. And we already talked about the sesamoid bones with patella, of how that works. But here you have it. They help making the movement of the muscle smooth and continuous. That's what they do. We talked about that. So that brings me to the trunk.